The ridge was silent except for the faint whistle of the mountain wind threading through the stones. The sun was sliding down, painting the sky with an amber glow, and below the ridge a team of exhausted soldiers moved like shadows across the rugged terrain. They had been ambushed 3 hours earlier, pushed off their original route, and were now trapped between enemy patrols sweeping the valley and the steep cliff walls that rose around them. Every one of them carried the look of men who had seen too much in too little time, faces smeared with dirt, uniforms torn, ammunition running low. Their leader, Captain Ramirez, scanned the ridge through his binoculars again and again, his jaw clenched trying to find a path out. But what he saw was not hope. It was danger waiting. High on that ridge, the enemy had placed a sniper's nest, and each time his men tried to move, bullets cracked into the rocks inches from their heads. They were pinned, hopelessly caught in a trap that tightened with every passing minute. None of them knew that salvation was already lying in the shadows above them, in the form of someone they would never have expected. A woman who, to their eyes, looked too ordinary to carry the weight of destiny. Her name was Alina, and to anyone who had met her before that day, she would have seemed like nothing more than a quiet villager. She lived in the outskirts near the valley, known for tending her goats, carrying water in clay jars, and selling wool in the markets once a week. She wore plain clothes, her hair always tied back with a simple scarf, and she spoke little. People called her kind, harmless, almost invisible, the sort of person who could vanish in a crowd without leaving a memory. But Alina's life had never been as plain as her neighbors imagined. Years ago, before she had returned to the valley, she had learned the language of rifles, the patience of watching horizons, the discipline of steady breath and steady aim. She had been a sharpshooter once, not by choice but by the demand of a war that had stolen her family and left her with nothing but skill and silence. When the battles faded, she had sworn never to touch a rifle again, burying her past in the folds of a simple existence. Yet fate is cruelly skilled at calling back what we think we have buried forever. That afternoon, Alina had been returning from the market with a sack of barley on her back when she heard the first distant echoes of gunfire. The sound carried strangely in the mountain air, sharp and thin, cutting through the usual chorus of goats and wind. She stopped on the trail, lifted her eyes to the ridge, and knew instantly what was happening. She had seen too many firefights not to recognize the rhythm of ambushes, the long silence, the sudden bursts, the desperate shouts that followed. Instinct pulled her forward. She climbed higher, leaving the sack of barley behind, her steps swift but careful, her heart pressing against her ribs. When she reached the flat stone shelf on the ridge, she lay low, crawling to the edge, and saw them. The soldiers pinned below, scattered behind boulders, their helmets catching the last glint of sun as bullets snapped around them. And across the ridge, half concealed behind a twisted pine, she spotted the glint of another scope, the enemy sniper holding them all hostage to his trigger finger. For a long moment, Alina lay there, her body torn between two worlds. One voice whispered to her that she had promised herself peace, that the war she once fought in was over and no bullet could bring back her family. The other voice, heavier and sharper, told her that if she did nothing, these men would die before night fell. She had not carried a rifle in years, but as she scanned the rocks, her hand brushed against something wrapped in cloth near the abandoned sniper's blind. A weapon, an old bolt-action rifle, left behind by fighters who had passed through days earlier. The barrel was scratched, the scope dulled, but the weight of it in her hands was like touching a piece of herself she thought was gone. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and felt the old rhythm return. Breath steady, heartbeat counted, vision narrowed until all the world was a single circle of glass. Down below, Captain Ramirez was already preparing his men for the worst. They could not stay pinned forever, and he knew the sniper would not miss forever. He was calculating the odds of a desperate sprint across the exposed ground when suddenly, sharply, a single shot cracked across the valley. It was not the enemy's rifle this time. It was different, colder, cleaner. The echo rolled across the ridge, and then there was silence. His men froze, waiting for the next bullet to whistle past. None came. Slowly, carefully, Ramirez raised his binoculars and scanned the ridge again. Where the enemy sniper had been hidden behind the pine, there was now only stillness. The scope that had haunted them no longer glinted in the sun. Whoever had fired that shot had saved them, if only for a moment. Alina lowered the rifle, her fingers trembling as she rested it against the rocks. She had not fired in years, but the bullet had flown true, guided by muscle memory and something deeper, something that had never left her. From her hidden place on the ridge, she watched the soldiers below, their faces lifted in stunned relief. She could not hear their voices, but she saw the way their shoulders eased, the way they looked toward the ridge with gratitude and disbelief. None of them could imagine that their rescuer was a woman who looked like she belonged only to the rhythm of goats and markets. She stayed low, invisible, because she knew this was only the beginning. Saving them with one bullet was not enough. The valley still crawled with enemies and the soldiers were far from safe. For Alina, the choice had already been made. She could not return to her quiet life now. War had pulled her back into its grasp, and her story with these men was only just beginning. The valley exhaled a hush after that shot, as though even the wind had paused to listen. Down below, the soldiers began to shift, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the ridge. Captain Ramirez held up his hand to silence them, his instincts telling him that their mysterious savior was still out there. He knew enough about battlefields to understand when fate had intervened, and this had been no accident. A bullet that precise, fired from such a distance, was the work of a marksman, or a ghost. He gave the signal for his men to regroup, crawling closer together behind the rocks. They were alive but still trapped, and night was closing in fast. The enemy patrols below would not wait long before pressing forward again. He needed a plan, and whoever had fired that shot might be the only hope of creating one. Alina remained hidden, her body pressed against the stone. Her pulse was still wild from the recoil of the rifle, but her eyes stayed sharp on the horizon. She knew the habits of soldiers, the way they moved after losing a sniper, the way confusion rippled through their ranks like a crack in ice. Already, across the slope, she could see the enemy fighters shifting uneasily, searching for the source of the shot. They would not retreat simply because one man had fallen. They would hunt. And when they did, the soldiers below would be the prey. Alina's hand tightened on the rifle. She had not intended to be part of this war again, but now her silence. At a cost. If she abandoned them, they would never make it out alive. She felt the weight of the choice like stone in her chest, yet deep down she knew there was no choice at all. Something inside her, something that had been quiet for too many years, had awakened with the pull of the trigger. The soldiers began to stir, edging closer together in the shadow of a fallen boulder. Captain Ramirez leaned low, speaking in a voice only his men could hear. "Someone's up there helping us," he muttered. "But we can't depend on luck. We move at dusk toward the river bend. It's our only shot." His men nodded grimly, though their eyes still flicked to the ridge, hoping for another miracle. One of them, a young private whose helmet sat crooked on his head, whispered, "Sir, what if it's a trap? What if they're luring us?" Ramirez didn't answer. He had no way of knowing. But his gut told him the truth, that the single bullet that had shattered the sniper's nest had not come from their enemy. There was something else at work here, something unseen, and for reasons he could not explain, he felt a strange confidence take root inside him. As twilight bled across the sky, the enemy shifted their strategy. Alina watched them through the scope, her cheek pressed against the cold wood of the rifle. Small groups of fighters were fanning out, circling down into the valley to tighten the noose around the soldiers. They moved with discipline, their rifles angled, their boots silent on the rock. Alina tracked them one by one, her finger brushing the trigger, but she held her fire. One shot she could risk, more would reveal her position too soon. She needed patience, needed the exact moment when her bullet could break the balance of the hunt. So she stayed low, invisible, her mind calculating angles, distances, and timing. Below her, the soldiers huddled, unaware that above their heads, a guardian was watching every shadow that moved toward them. The first wave of enemy fighters reached the lower slope, and the crack of gunfire erupted again. The valley lit with sparks as bullets ricocheted off stone. The soldiers scrambled to respond, their rifles barking desperately, but the angle was against them. They were firing uphill into shadows, and for every enemy they forced back, another slipped closer. Alina's breath slowed, her heartbeat steadying into the rhythm she had mastered long ago. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the silence shattered. A fighter dropped instantly, his rifle clattering against the rock. Confusion spread through the enemy ranks. They ducked, searching the ridge, but Alina had already shifted her position, crawling to another outcrop before they could trace the sound. Again she lined up her scope, and again a single shot broke the night. Another enemy fell. The balance tipped, and the soldiers below seized the chance, rising from cover to push forward with renewed fire. Captain Ramirez understood immediately. Whoever was on the ridge was not just helping them, they were orchestrating the battle. The precision of the shots, the timing, the way each bullet arrived exactly when his men were about to be overrun, it was as if an unseen commander was guiding them. He barked orders, rallying his men to advance toward the river bend, and for the first time all day hope surged through their veins. The young private who had doubted whispered again, but this time with awe. "Sir, it's like someone's protecting us." Ramirez did not reply, but he lifted his eyes once more toward the ridge, wondering who this invisible savior was. The fight dragged on into the darkness, the valley alive with muzzle flashes and the echoes of shouted commands. Alina kept firing sparingly, each shot calculated, each target chosen with surgical precision. But with every pull of the trigger she felt herself slipping further from the life she had tried to rebuild. The quiet woman of the village was gone. On that ridge, in the heart of battle, the sharpshooter she had once buried was alive again. And though part of her ached with the knowledge that peace had slipped from her grasp, another part burned with purpose. She was not just saving strangers. She was reclaiming the part of herself that the war had once stolen. She was proving, bullet by bullet, that her existence still carried weight in a world that had nearly erased her. When the last of the enemy fighters retreated into the night, the valley was left in exhausted silence. The soldiers collapsed behind rocks, panting, counting their dwindling ammunition. Captain Ramirez stood tall, scanning the ridge one last time. He saw nothing, no figure, no movement, just the silhouette of stones against the moonlight. Whoever had saved them had vanished as quietly as they had appeared. He wanted to call out, to shout his thanks into the night, but something inside told him that the one watching did not want recognition. She wanted only to keep the shadows at bay. And so he let the silence stand, though his heart carried a vow. If fate allowed it, he would find out who had fired those bullets, and why a ghost on a ridge had chosen to rescue his men. Night settled thick over the valley, and the soldiers lit no fires, speaking only in low murmurs as they regrouped near the bend of the river. Their bodies ached from the weight of the day, their nerves frayed from hours of combat, yet none of them could sleep. They had been minutes away from annihilation, and now, against all odds, they still breathed. Every man felt it, the presence of someone unseen who had tilted the scale in their favor. Some muttered prayers of thanks, others stared up at the ridge with restless eyes, as though expecting the figure of their rescuer to materialize in the moonlight. But the ridge was empty, silent, only the slow crawl of clouds across the stars. Captain Ramirez sat apart from his men, his rifle across his lap, his mind grinding with questions. He had fought long enough to know that miracles rarely arrive uninvited. Whoever had fired those precise shots had chosen them deliberately, and such choices were never simple. He could not rest until he knew why. Alina had withdrawn farther up the ridge after the battle, slipping into the thicket of pines where the moonlight struggled to pierce. She crouched beneath a twisted trunk, the rifle laid carefully across her knees, and let her body shiver as the weight of the night pressed down. Her fingers still tingled from the recoil, and her ears rang with the memory of each shot. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the calm of her old village life, the bleating of goats, the chatter of market stalls, the smell of bread baking on a neighbor's fire, but the images refused to take hold. Instead, her mind replayed the faces of the soldiers she had seen below. Young men crouched behind stones, fear carved into their eyes, yet still clinging to each other, still refusing to surrender. She had not meant to become part of their story, but now she was entangled in it, and deep inside she knew she could not walk away. If she left them now, the enemy would regroup, stronger, more ruthless, and the men she had saved would die anyway. The burden of their survival sat heavy on her shoulders, heavier even than the rifle she carried. Far below, the enemy was not idle. Their commander, a scarred veteran known only by the name Harkan, paced furiously in the dark, his men gathered in a semicircle around him. He had lost too many fighters that day, not because of the soldiers' skill but because of a ghost hidden on the ridge. His pride could not allow such humiliation. He slammed his fist against a rock, swearing in a low growl. "There is a sniper," he said, his voice thick with rage. "Someone is watching us, someone who knows how to kill. We find them, we drag them out, and we make them pay." His men nodded grimly, their faces lit by the faint glow of cigarettes. They were not afraid of the soldiers pinned below. Their true fear was of the invisible eye that had turned their ambush into chaos. And so they began to spread out, climbing the slopes in silence, searching for the phantom who haunted the ridge. Alina sensed them before she saw them. Years of experience had sharpened her awareness to the smallest signs: the distant crunch of a boot on loose gravel, the faint shift of air as bodies moved through the trees. She pressed her body flat against the ground, her breath slowing until it almost stopped. Through the scope she caught glimpses of shadows weaving upward, methodical, hunting. Her chest tightened. They had realized she was there. Her cover was thinning, her position exposed, and she could not outlast a full search. She thought briefly of retreating deeper into the mountains, disappearing into the wilderness, but then she pictured the soldiers below, unknowing, resting in fragile hope. If she abandoned them now, the hunters would sweep down and finish what they had started. No, she could not leave. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, wiped the sweat from her palms, and prepared herself for a night far darker than the one she had already endured. Captain Ramirez could not sleep either. He sat with his back to a rock, scanning the ridge through the dim light of a pocket scope. His men murmured behind him, but his focus never wavered. Something gnawed at him, a feeling that danger was shifting above them. Suddenly, faint flashes pricked the darkness high on the ridge, muzzle fire but not aimed at them. He frowned, straining his eyes. The enemy was searching for someone. His heart quickened as realization struck. The ghost on the ridge was not untouchable. Whoever had saved them was now being hunted, alone, by a swarm of fighters who wanted revenge. He stood abruptly, startling the men nearest him. "We move," he ordered in a low, urgent voice. "Up the ridge. Now." His soldiers hesitated, exhaustion etched deep into their bones, but Ramirez's tone brooked no refusal. They should have been retreating, but instinct told him that their survival was bound to the one above them. If the sniper fell, so would they. The climb was brutal, the rocks slick with dew, the night thick with shadows. The soldiers moved like phantoms, guided by Ramirez's determination, their boots muffled by soil and moss. As they rose higher, the sounds of gunfire grew clearer, sporadic, sharp, the measured rhythm of a sniper resisting the press of many. Each crack echoed against the cliffs, each silence filled with dread. When they reached the lip of the ridge, they froze, staring into the chaos ahead. Enemy fighters crawled among the trees, their rifles barking in bursts, while a lone figure darted from stone to stone, her rifle snapping with deadly precision. In the pale wash of moonlight, her form was unmistakable. Not a soldier, not a man, but a woman with a scarf tied back, her movements fluid, her courage carved into every step. The soldiers stared in disbelief, and for a moment none of them could speak. The harmless villager they might have passed on any road was here, standing against death itself, holding the ridge alone. Captain Ramirez felt a surge of respect unlike anything he had known. This was no ghost, no myth. This was flesh and blood, courage and skill, someone who had chosen to risk everything for men she did not know. Without hesitation, he raised his rifle and shouted, "Cover her!" His men responded instantly, unleashing fire into the enemy ranks. The ridge exploded with noise as battle roared again, but now Alina was not alone. The soldiers she had saved had come for her, and together they began to drive the hunters back into the shadows. For the first time that night, Alina felt something stir in her chest, something she had not allowed herself in years. She felt the strength of belonging, of fighting not as a ghost, but as part of something greater. And though the night was far from over, she knew she was no longer carrying the weight of her past alone. The night air was thick with smoke and the tang of spent gunpowder as Alina and the soldiers pressed forward, moving along the ridge with deadly precision. Each step was measured, each breath controlled, yet the tension between them was almost palpable. Captain Ramirez led the way, rifle raised, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the enemy. The men behind him followed silently, their trust in the mysterious sharpshooter above strengthening their resolve. Alina, crouched low behind a jutting rock, felt the rhythm of battle return to her veins, the way her body had once known by instinct alone. Every sense was alert, the snap of a twig, the glint of moonlight on metal, the subtle movements of shadow that could conceal a lethal rifle barrel. She moved as silently as a fox, each shot she fired precise and deliberate, each enemy that fell giving the soldiers below the courage to advance. The enemy, now aware that the soldiers had regrouped, became more desperate. Harkan, the scarred commander, realized too late that his trap had failed, and his anger was volcanic. He barked orders through the night, gesturing to his men to encircle the ridge, to flank the soldiers and take the sniper. But the coordination of his fighters faltered under Alina's deadly accuracy and the sudden, fearless advance of the soldiers. They had underestimated her. They had believed the quiet villager could never stand against trained soldiers, but she had not only survived, she had turned the battlefield into her domain. Bullets cracked, ricocheted, and echoed across the cliffs, but each enemy that dared to appear was met with steel and silence, Alina's rifle picking them off one by one. Her calm was terrifying, her precision unnerving, and the soldiers below began to feel a shift in the battle. Hope was returning. Captain Ramirez, seeing the tide turning, made a quick decision. "We push toward the plateau ahead," he whispered, low enough that only the closest men could hear. "If we can hold that position, we'll have a defensible point and the high ground for the morning." The soldiers nodded, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. Every step was dangerous. The terrain was jagged and enemy fighters still lurked in shadows, waiting to ambush. But they moved as one, a unit bound by survival and the invisible hand that had guided them so far. Alina kept pace above them, covering their advance, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She could feel each heartbeat, each whispered prayer, each tentative step of the soldiers below, and it steeled her determination. She would not fail. Not now. Not ever. Halfway to the plateau, a volley of enemy fire erupted from the treeline, striking close enough to make the soldiers duck behind rocks. One man cried out as a bullet grazed his shoulder, pain searing through him. Captain Ramirez swore under his breath, firing in response, but Alina's sharp eyes had already identified the shooters. 2 precise shots later, the attackers fell back into cover, their plans disrupted, their morale shaken. The soldiers below began to shout, rallying each other, their courage buoyed by her deadly efficiency. "We can make it," one yelled, and the others echoed it with fierce determination. For the first time that night, the soldiers began to move not just for survival but for victory. Alina allowed herself a brief glance downward. Their faces, dirt-streaked and tense, reflected both exhaustion and an unmistakable spark of hope. She had done more than save them with bullets, she had reignited their will to fight. The climb grew steeper as they approached the plateau. Loose stones tumbled beneath their boots, and the enemy was regrouping, preparing for one final push to regain control of the ridge. Alina crouched at the edge, feeling the familiar hum of anticipation in her muscles. Her breath slowed, her finger hovered lightly on the trigger, and she surveyed the valley with the cold clarity that had once saved countless lives. A shadow moved along the treeline, too slow, too careful. Another shot, and another enemy went down, their bodies crumpling silently. Her work was not over, but the momentum was shifting. Captain Ramirez, noticing the change, signaled his men forward. Slowly, carefully, they ascended the final stretch, inching toward the plateau, shields of stone and grit around them. Every movement was tense, but the enemy could no longer control them. The soldiers had regained the initiative, and it was a dangerous, exhilarating thing. When they finally reached the plateau, the soldiers collapsed behind large boulders, their chests heaving, arms trembling from the weight of rifles and adrenaline. Alina stayed low, scanning the valley below, her eyes tracing every movement, calculating every potential threat. She knew that the enemy would not surrender so easily. Harkin's pride would demand at least one more desperate attempt to reclaim the ridge. The soldiers looked up at her, a mixture of awe and confusion in their eyes. Captain Ramirez called out, his voice carrying over the plateau. "Whoever you are, thank you. You saved us all tonight." There was no response, only the quiet shifting of wind through the pines. Alina did not move from her position. Recognition was never her goal. She had acted out of necessity, instinct, and a quiet sense of justice that had not dimmed despite the years. She had returned to the ridge not for glory but to ensure survival. That alone was enough. As the first light of dawn began to stretch across the mountains, the valley below was eerily still. The enemy had retreated, their morale shattered by the relentless defense and the fear of the unseen sniper. The soldiers on the plateau breathed, their bodies exhausted, their hearts pounding, but their spirits lifted. Captain Ramirez lowered his rifle, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He knew the day was theirs not because of luck, but because of a single extraordinary woman who had chosen to stand against impossible odds. For Alina, the sun's rise brought no relief, only the quiet understanding that her life had changed irrevocably. She could no longer hide among goats and market stalls. She had been called back into the rhythm of war, and she had answered. Her heart still carried the ghosts of the past, but now it also carried a fierce, undeniable purpose. She would protect, she would fight, and she would survive, not as a shadow but as a force no one could ignore. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the plateau, illuminating the jagged rocks and the exhausted soldiers who had claimed it. Captain Ramirez moved among his men, checking wounds, rationing water, and ensuring that everyone remained alert. The valley below was silent, almost deceptively so, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. Enemy forces might be regrouping, waiting for reinforcements, or preparing an ambush. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down like the mountains themselves. And above all, his thoughts kept returning to the woman who had saved them, Alina, though he did not yet know her name. She had vanished into the trees before dawn, leaving only the faint echo of her presence. He vowed he would find her. He had to. Not only for gratitude, but because she had proven herself a force unlike any other he had ever encountered. Alina, perched higher among a stand of twisted pines, watched the soldiers' movements from a distance. Her sharp eyes scanned the valley, calculating the angles and positions of possible threats. Though the enemy had retreated, she knew it was temporary. Harken would not allow defeat to go unpunished, and every instinct in her body screamed that he would strike again, more cunning and dangerous than before. She could see the way the soldiers were regrouping, their coordination improving but still imperfect. Her heart ached for them. They had survived this long, but without guidance, without precision, they would falter when the next wave came. She tightened her grip on the rifle, her mind racing with strategies, angles and escape routes. She had returned to the battlefield not for glory, but because she understood the stakes better than anyone. Survival required not just courage but foresight, and she had both in abundance. Below, Captain Ramirez gathered his men for a brief council. "We hold the plateau," he said, his voice low but firm. "We reinforce our positions and wait. The enemy will come back, and when they do, we must be ready." The soldiers nodded, their faces marked by exhaustion and grim determination. They had survived a night that would have broken lesser men, and now they had a second chance to prove themselves. Still, the tension lingered. No one spoke of the sniper on the ridge. Her actions had saved their lives, yes, but they also reminded them how fragile their survival truly was. Each man knew that if she had not been there, many of them would already lie broken in the valley below. The thought unsettled them, a reminder that heroes sometimes worked in silence, without acknowledgement, and sometimes disappeared before gratitude could be expressed. The day grew hotter, the sun climbing higher, baking the plateau and forcing the soldiers into constant vigilance. Alina remained hidden, moving from cover to cover, her rifle ready at all times. Her mind never wavered from the calculations of possible enemy positions. She anticipated patrols, plotted angles for defensive fire, and scanned the horizon for Harken himself. The scarred commander had to be somewhere nearby, rallying his forces, seeking a way to reclaim the ridge. Her instincts told her that he would not strike openly, not with the plateau held by determined soldiers. Instead, he would use trickery, diversion, and stealth, the kind of tactics she had learned to counter during years she had long tried to forget. The thought of returning to that rhythm of calculated violence both unnerved and thrilled her. She realized that she had been waiting for this, even if she hadn't admitted it, the chance to test herself again, to fight with precision and purpose. By mid-afternoon, a flicker of movement in the valley caught Alina's attention. A small group of enemy fighters, no more than a dozen, was advancing cautiously toward a lower ridge, seemingly unaware that their approach was being observed. She froze, counting each man, noting their spacing and their rhythm. The soldiers below would soon be in range, and she considered intervening immediately. But something in her calculated mind warned patience. If she struck too soon, the enemy would scatter, adapt, and regroup. If she waited and coordinated with the soldiers' advance, they could trap the attackers, neutralizing the threat efficiently. Quietly, she shifted, aligning herself with the line of sight that would give her the perfect vantage. Every heartbeat felt amplified, each second stretching longer than the last. The moment of action was imminent, and she was ready to strike with unerring precision. Captain Ramirez, sensing movement below, ordered a few men to take positions along the edge of the plateau. He understood instinctively that someone above was watching, guiding their choices. The soldiers moved quietly, spreading into defensive positions while maintaining cover behind boulders and jagged rocks. The enemy advanced, slowly, cautiously, unaware that they were walking into a trap they could not see. Then, with the sharpness of a thunderclap, Alina's rifle spoke. 2 soldiers dropped immediately, their comrades faltering in shock. Captain Ramirez gave the order to fire, and the remaining attackers scrambled, disoriented and terrified, as the soldiers on the plateau unleashed a coordinated volley. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. The attackers retreated, leaving the plateau unchallenged, their morale shattered. The soldiers below cheered softly, exchanging glances that carried awe and disbelief. Whoever had saved them last night, and guided them today, was truly extraordinary. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Alina retreated further into the pines. She watched the soldiers move with growing confidence, grateful that her intervention had not been needed for every single step. Captain Ramirez, still scanning the ridge, caught a fleeting shadow among the trees. He squinted, heart pounding, but it was gone before he could confirm it. Still, he could feel her presence, the quiet strength that had saved them from annihilation, the skill and determination that had protected their lives. He did not speak of her aloud, yet a vow formed in his mind. He would find her, thank her properly, and ensure she knew that she had not acted in vain. For now the ridge was held, the plateau secured, and the soldiers alive, but the war was far from over. Somewhere in the valley Harkin's fury simmered, and Alina knew that the next encounter would be far deadlier than the last. But for this moment, for this fragile hour of safety, she allowed herself a rare, quiet sense of triumph. A fleeting but precious victory in the endless game of survival. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the plateau and turning the valley into a landscape of gold and shadow. Captain Ramirez moved among his men, reinforcing their positions, digging trenches where the rocky soil allowed, and keeping a sharp eye on the valley below. The soldiers were exhausted, but the taste of victory, however temporary, had ignited their spirits. Each man moved with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that survival was no longer just a fragile hope but something they could fight for with skill and strategy. Yet, amidst the rhythm of preparation, Ramirez could not shake the feeling that the true danger was still lurking. Hidden, patient, and cunning. He glanced at the ridge, searching the shadows for any sign of the woman who had saved them twice. He had not seen her since morning, but he knew instinctively she was still nearby. And he also knew that Harkan, scarred and relentless, had not given up. Alina moved silently through the pines higher than the plateau, observing both the soldiers and the approaching dusk. Her heart beat steadily, but her mind was a storm of calculations. Harkan would not strike openly, he never had. The man thrived on deception, exploiting weakness and turning hesitation into death. She had learned his patterns during countless skirmishes, studied the rhythm of his tactics, and now she could anticipate them. The soldiers below were strong but inexperienced. If Harkin sent another wave they could be overwhelmed. It was her responsibility to ensure they survived. She crouched behind a jagged trunk, scanning the distant ridges, counting shadows, and reading the faint signs of movement in the undergrowth. Every detail mattered. Every second could decide who lived and who died. Far below, Harkin crouched behind a boulder at the edge of the valley, surveying the plateau with cold calculation. His jaw tightened as he watched the soldiers fortify their position. Pride burned like fire in his chest. He would not accept defeat. He had underestimated the ghost on the ridge once, and it would not happen again. This time he would draw her out, lure her into the open, and eliminate both her and the soldiers in a single decisive strike. His mind churned with schemes, traps, and diversions. He sent two of his most trusted fighters along a narrow ravine to probe the plateau's defenses, hoping to force the sniper into revealing herself. Harkin's dark eyes gleamed with anticipation. The hunt was no longer just for the rich, it was personal. Alina noticed the movement immediately. Her sharp instincts had always been attuned to the slightest shift in the environment. She saw the faint outline of two men maneuvering through the ravine, their rifles angled, their bodies low and cautious. She did not fire immediately. Patience was crucial. If she struck too soon, the soldiers below could be exposed. Instead, she repositioned herself, finding a higher vantage point where she could see the entire approach while remaining concealed. Her finger hovered over the trigger, every muscle in her body coiled and ready. The enemy would not pass unscathed, and she intended to ensure it. Then, with calm precision, two shots rang out from the ridge. Both men fell silently, their bodies hitting the earth with a soft thud. Alina exhaled slowly, observing the remaining enemy forces with unyielding focus. Harkin's trap had been partially undone, and he would realize it soon. Captain Ramirez and his soldiers below sensed the shift immediately. "Two down," one whispered, pointing toward the ravine. Ramirez scanned the ridge, eyes narrowing. "She's still up there," he murmured under his breath, awe and determination mixing in his voice. "She's watching, guiding us. Don't make a sound. Move carefully." The soldiers nodded, moving cautiously, taking cover behind rocks, and fortifying positions without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Each man felt the invisible presence above them, a guardian, a protector, a force that had become almost legendary in their eyes. And yet, despite her assistance, they understood the battle was far from over. The enemy would strike again, and this time they would be more cunning, more ruthless. As dusk deepened, a sudden noise, a sharp, snapping twig, caught Alina's attention. She froze instantly, spotting movement in the dense foliage to her right. Her heart quickened slightly, though her body remained steady. It was Harkan himself, moving silently along a hidden path, attempting to flank the plateau and confront her directly. His scarred face was set in a mask of fury, his eyes locked on the ridge. For the first time in the battle, their eyes met across the distance. In that instant, each recognized the other. Predator and prey, strategist and counter-strategist, two forces bound by circumstance and skill. Alina tightened her grip on her rifle, but a small sharp smile touched her lips. This was the confrontation she had anticipated. This was the true test of her abilities and her resolve. Harkan had underestimated her before, but he would not underestimate her again. She calculated rapidly, plotting angles, escape routes, and potential traps. The soldiers below were unaware of his presence, focusing on fortifying the plateau, leaving her to face him alone. Her pulse steadied, her mind narrowed, and she made her decision. She would not wait for him to strike first. Precision, speed, and calculated intimidation would give her the advantage. As Harkan advanced, unaware of the sniper's exact location, she pressed herself flat against the ridge, aimed carefully, and fired. The bullet cut through the air with deadly accuracy, striking near him, forcing him to dive behind cover. The game of cat and mouse had begun, and Alina was ready to turn it into a battle he could not win. Every move, every breath, every shot would count. The ridge, the plateau, and the lives of the soldiers below were all in her hands. Tonight, she would prove once and for all that courage and skill could defy even the most ruthless hunter. The night had fully descended, shrouding the valley in darkness, with only the faint silver glow of the moon illuminating the jagged ridges. Alina crouched high among the pines, her eyes tracking Harkan's movements with a predator's focus. He had retreated behind a boulder after her first shot, muttering curses under his breath. She could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand twitched near his weapon, anticipating her next move. Every instinct screamed that he was dangerous, but he had underestimated her before, and he would make the same mistake again. Her mind raced through calculations, angles, timing, wind, trajectory, and escape routes. She was a master of this terrain, the shadows her allies, the ridge her fortress. Harkan, for all his strength and experience, was intruding into her domain. Below, Captain Ramirez's soldiers tightened their positions, unaware that their guardian on the ridge was about to engage the scarred commander directly. The soldiers whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward the ridge, sensing movement but unable to identify its source. Alina's presence was a silent force that had become their shield, guiding and protecting without revealing itself. Every so often, a faint metallic glint from her rifle caught the moonlight, a reminder that something watched over them. Ramirez felt a mixture of gratitude and awe, recognizing that without this unseen sniper, the plateau would have been lost hours ago. He checked the positions, whispered a few orders, and waited, knowing that the next move could decide the fate of everyone on the plateau. Harkan peered out from behind his cover, eyes scanning the ridge for the elusive sniper. He had survived countless skirmishes, but the precision, patience, and ruthlessness of his unknown adversary unnerved him. His plans for a swift victory had crumbled, and now he faced a foe who understood the terrain, the tactics, and the psychology of battle in ways he had not anticipated. He clenched his teeth, gripping his rifle tightly, and moved cautiously, attempting to flank her position. Every step was calculated, yet he was stepping into the trap she had prepared, unknowingly walking into a duel where stealth, speed, and cunning would outweigh raw strength. The moment had come. The battle would no longer be fought with waves of soldiers but as a precise, personal confrontation between two extraordinary adversaries. Alina shifted silently to a new vantage point, higher and closer to the edge of the ridge. Her breath was steady, her body perfectly balanced. The moonlight glinted off the scope of her rifle, but she remained concealed behind a thick pine trunk. She observed Harkan's movements, noting his rhythm, anticipating his strategy. He believed himself in control, but every instinct in her body told her that he was predictable when cornered. She adjusted her position slightly, aligning herself with the angle of approach, and prepared for the first critical shot. A single pull of the trigger could create a decisive advantage, disrupting his momentum and forcing him into open vulnerability. Timing, she knew, was everything. Precision would determine survival. The scarred commander advanced cautiously, unaware of her elevated position. His focus was on locating her, not realizing that her advantage was not merely in her rifle but in her patience, calculation, and understanding of the battlefield. He moved with skill, but Alina had the ridge memorized in her mind like a living map. Every rock, shadow, and tree became part of her strategy. She fired a shot, not to kill but to force him to reveal his position. The bullet struck the ground mere inches from his boot, sending a plume of dirt into the air. Harkan cursed loudly, spinning around, scanning the ridge. He was enraged, realizing he was no longer in command of the engagement. He adjusted his position, seeking cover, but she had already anticipated his movement, predicting the angles of his retreat with uncanny accuracy. From the plateau below, Ramirez and his men caught sight of Harkin flinching under unseen fire. A tension that had been building for hours erupted into a visible shift in the battlefield. The soldiers aimed their rifles cautiously, though they knew it was Alina, not them, dictating the flow of engagement. A coordinated volley from the plateau combined with Alina's precise fire created chaos among Harkin's forces. Confusion reigned. He barked orders, but the soldiers he sent to flank her were struck down before they could reach the ridge. His frustration grew, and for the first time his confidence wavered. He realized that he was facing not just a sniper, but a strategist, a shadow that moved through the night with lethal certainty. His fury was palpable, but so was his fear. He had never faced such an opponent. Alina seized the opportunity. She shifted again, moving higher along the ridge, keeping her body low, her rifle trained. She could see Harkin now, crouched behind a rock, assessing options, cornered yet dangerous. Her finger hovered lightly over the trigger, every muscle tense with anticipation. She did not hesitate. A series of shots fired with controlled rhythm, precise and deadly, forced Harkin to retreat further. He stumbled, tripped over jagged stones, and barely regained his footing, cursing under his breath. Alina's eyes followed his every movement, calculating the angles for her next engagement. This was more than battle, it was a test of nerves, skill, and survival instinct. Every move mattered. Every heartbeat could decide the outcome. Harkin realized that escape was impossible without exposure. He had to confront the sniper directly or risk complete annihilation. His pride would not allow him to flee. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward her presumed position, every step cautious, his rifle raised, eyes scanning for the unseen enemy. Alina watched, silent and unyielding. She understood that this was the moment where skill met instinct, where patience met opportunity. When he was close enough, she would strike decisively, not just to preserve her life, but to end the relentless threat he posed. Tonight, the ridge, the plateau, and the lives of the soldiers below rested in her hands. One shot, one calculated move, could decide everything. The night was heavy with tension, silence punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of retreating enemy forces. Alina crouched high on the ridge, her rifle trained on Harkin, who now moved with measured caution, fully aware that he was being hunted as much as he was hunting. The moonlight glinted off the edges of his scarred face, revealing the fury and frustration etched into every line. Pride and desperation drove him, but he had underestimated her patience, her precision, and her command of the battlefield. Every instinct screamed that he would make a fatal mistake if he advanced without care. Alina had waited for this moment her entire life, the moment where skill, experience, and intuition would converge to decide not just survival but victory. Below, Captain Ramirez watched the ridge, senses alert, heart pounding. He could not see Alina, but her presence dominated the battlefield. His soldiers tightened positions along the edge, rifles ready, eyes scanning the shadows. Every move they made was subtly guided by her unseen hand. They knew Harkin's forces were scattered, but the scarred commander remained a dangerous, unpredictable threat. Ramirez whispered a single order: "Hold steady. Don't engage unless necessary. Let her lead." The men complied, eyes wide with anticipation, realizing that the unseen sniper on the ridge was not only a protector but the key to the plateau's survival. Harkin advanced slowly, each step deliberate, the rifle in his hands an extension of his calculated fury. His mind raced with possibilities, how to flank, how to intimidate, how to strike before she could react. But he felt the trap tightening with every movement. He sensed the unseen eyes tracking him, analyzing, anticipating. Each step was measured, yet tension coiled in his muscles like a spring. He underestimated her before, and that mistake had cost him lives. Now he knew he was at a disadvantage. The ridge was her domain, the high ground her fortress, and he was exposed, vulnerable, and blinded by fury. Alina remained motionless, hidden behind a thick pine trunk, breathing slowly, every nerve coiled with purpose. Her eyes followed him with surgical precision, calculating the angles, the distance, the trajectory, the wind. This was not a mere firefight. This was a duel of minds, a test of reflexes, patience, and strategy. One wrong move on his part, one slight miscalculation, and she would have the decisive advantage. She waited for the exact moment, the precise instant when his arrogance and desperation would leave him vulnerable. Her finger hovered over the trigger. The valley below was silent, the soldiers holding their breaths, sensing the climax of a battle they could barely comprehend. Harkin paused at the edge of the ridge, scanning the shadows for the slightest hint of her presence. He was aware at last that he had walked into a trap. His eyes darted, but Alina had already anticipated this movement, predicting his every hesitation and calculating the angle for her shot. A single breath, a single squeeze of the trigger, and she fired. The bullet struck just ahead of him, embedding into the rock with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Harkin jerked back instinctively, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. The moment of hesitation was all she needed. She shifted slightly, aiming again with perfect alignment, and fired twice more in quick succession. The shots hit their marks, striking his weapon and forcing him to drop to cover, scrambling desperately to avoid the lethal precision raining down from above. Below, the soldiers erupted in cautious cheers, their morale skyrocketing as the tide of battle swung decisively in their favor. Captain Ramirez allowed himself a small smile, knowing that their protector, the mysterious sniper, had neutralized the most dangerous threat without exposing herself to unnecessary risk. Harkin's forces, seeing their leader falter, began to retreat, disorganized and fearful, leaving the plateau uncontested. Victory, long uncertain and perilous, now rested firmly in the hands of those who had survived the night. Alina did not pursue Harkin immediately. She knew the battle was won. The remaining enemy forces would not challenge her carefully prepared defenses. She lowered her rifle, scanning the ridge and the valley below. Her eyes softened briefly, the adrenaline fading enough to allow a rare moment of relief. The soldiers were safe, the plateau secured, and Harkin defeated, at least for now. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that her skill and resolve had made the difference between life and death for the men below. Captain Ramirez moved carefully to the edge of the plateau, peering up at the ridge, searching for her. He could not see her, but he sensed her presence, the invisible force that had guided, protected, and saved his men twice. He whispered a quiet vow, "I will find you. You deserve to be recognized." The soldiers, exhausted and wary, began securing their positions, their movements now guided by renewed hope rather than fear. The plateau, once a precarious advantage, had become a stronghold, a testament to skill, courage, and determination. Alina retreated further into the trees, her shadow merging with the night. She watched the soldiers below, satisfaction in her chest tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from over. Harkin had been defeated tonight, but his fury and cunning would not dissipate. For now, however, she allowed herself a rare moment of triumph. She had proven that courage, patience, and precision could overcome even the most ruthless adversary. The ridge, the plateau, and the soldiers she had protected were safe, and in the quiet of the night, she allowed herself to feel something she rarely permitted: pride. As dawn approached, Alina melted into the shadows, leaving behind only whispers of her presence and the memory of a woman who had defied fate, skillfully and silently, to save an entire team. The plateau stood unbroken, the soldiers alive and ready to face the challenges ahead, and the legend of the mysterious sniper, whose courage and precision had turned the tide of battle, would endure in the hearts of those who had witnessed her deadly grace. The end.